Welcome to this webinar. Good afternoon and good morning to some of you. Some familiar faces in the room, some new faces. Welcome. Welcome to this Foresight for Food webinar. Looking forward to have a nice session with you all. And greetings to you. If you're able to join by camera and you can wave, that's great. Hi, Minke. I see a familiar face there. Hello, welcome. Yeah, Osama, thank you. Great. Yeah, nice. So welcome everyone to this webinar on foresight and policy, entry points to food system transformation. Really great to have you here with us today. We'll have a really nice program with you. So I'll just slowly sort of get this going while more people are coming into the room. Just to make sure that you're all aware, this session will be recorded, and we'll be also sharing that recording later so people can review it. My name is Bram Peters. I am the Foresight for Food Global Facilitator, and as such, I'll be moderating the session. So once again, welcome, and let's get started. So as I mentioned, this is a webinar that is part of a regular series that we do. So this is now on foresight and policy, but a few weeks ago we had a session on the hidden cost and the cost of the future food system as well, which was very nice. And we'll also have more webinars to come. And it's also an invitation for you to join us. So if you have something to share, we also offer a platform for that as well. So feel free to reach out. I'm very happy to welcome with us today Professor Kerstin Cuhls from Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research. It's really great that you're here with us, Kerstin, and we're really looking forward to your presentation as well. Just to let you know, Foresight for Food is a network organization. It's a global network of different international institutes, research, funders, food systems initiatives, different providers and users of foresight. And it's all around how can we use foresight, scenario analysis, futures thinking to support food system change, food system transformation. And we do that in different ways. We do that through enhancing capacities to use foresight and scenario analysis. We try to link food systems practitioners to foresight experts. We try to link participatory processes and quantitative modeling together as well, and especially also sharing of different experiences at different levels, whether country, regional, or global. And this is part of what we do, but we also have live events also taking place. Notably, our global workshop is set to take place in Jordan this year. So you're also welcome to join us there. For today, the agenda, we've got 1.5 hours, so be with us. And I think it will be very nice because we'll have a welcome and warm-up questions for you in a minute. Just a brief introduction to get you started on the topic. Then Professor Kerstin Cuhls will give a keynote on foresight and policy. And then a response will be given by my colleague, Monica Zurek from Foresight for Food and University of Oxford. And then we'll have a bit of group work just to get a bit of an exchange about, what do you see happening in your food systems or your countries? And we'll be introduced to that by Deepika Manoharan. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right, Deepika, but from Wageningen Social and Economic Research. And we'll have a bit of a brainstorm using Neural. And we'll come back together again in plenary just for a bit of sharing as well and hearing from you all, which will then, of course, lead to the wrap-up. So this is the program for today. But in order to get you started and get you thinking a bit, I'd like to ask you to have to answer a few questions. And for that, we have a short Mentimeter. So let me ask Arfa to share the Mentimeter questions for the audience. And if you're not able to join the Menti plugin in Zoom, feel free to just write your answer in the chat, and we'll also see that coming by as well. So the first question is fairly straightforward. I think it's coming in now. And you can click on the right-hand side, you can click join. And the first question is just a little bit about your background. So from what perspective are you coming into this session? Are you a policymaker? Are you a food systems researcher? Are you a farmer? Are you a producer of food in a particular country? It can be anything. Try to write in a few words a little bit about your background, just so we know a little bit who's in the room. All right, so we have some foresighters. We've got policy advisors. We've got food systems researchers. Yes, great. More food system researchers. Great. Farmer foresight. Okay, that's interesting. So that's using foresight from a farm perspective, I would imagine. Transition expert. We've got UN, I think, here as well. Consumption research is here. A student. Yes, that's good. Diet-related health backgrounds. Yes, that's also coming in. Food lovers. I like that. I think we're all food lovers in a way. So I think that's a great perspective to bring in here. Angela, yeah, thanks for writing in the chat. I see you're a food environment researcher. Great. Yeah, well noted. Good. So we've got quite a few different backgrounds coming in here. I see there's more foresighters coming in. Agricultural development is here. Okay, good. All right, so this is all different perspectives bringing in both foresight as well as food systems expertise. Food science technology is coming in as well now. Excellent. All right, so this is really nice. Just to get you started, and feel free to write down a bit more about yourself in the chat and where you're based, and just so we know who's in the room as well. That's very welcome, because that's always nice to know. We've got a nice different range of backgrounds usually in these kind of calls, so feel free to also connect. Great, so let's have the next question, Arfa. So the question is, what do you think are the biggest challenges for policymakers regarding the future of food systems? Okay, so some have already been able to write a few answers here as well. That's great. I see already increasing uncertainty, navigating complexity, breaking sectoral silos, long-term thinking, thinking in systems. I see there's someone saying the big picture. So what's the big picture of the system? The challenge of managing short-term and long-term perspectives. That's definitely coming up as an issue. Conflicting values. Someone's writing corporate interests. So here's a bit sort of the power of big business, perhaps, that's influencing policymakers. So I see there's a few ones that are maybe from the previous question, but that's fine. I see someone's writing narrow and short-sighted. Yeah, so that's also maybe that short-term focus on short-term goals within a particular domain. Someone's writing coordination, power disparities. Okay, great. So this is really good, because this already shows the complexity and the challenges that policymakers face when it comes to governance of food systems and how to navigate towards the future of the food system. Okay, this is really good, because this is all going to be sort of somehow coming back in this session, either through the lecture or through the keynote or through the group work. So this is really nice. And yeah, keep this in the back of your mind as you're listening to this story. Let's have the third question, Arfa. So what foresight tools do you imagine are most valuable to support policymakers? There's a few answers already emerging. I think there's one on stress testing policies and identifying scenarios. Yes, that's definitely a very big part of some of the foresight toolbox. Okay, there's a few questions mixing the last one as well, but that's fine. Three Horizons framework. There's vision building. Angela, thanks for keeping to write up in the chat. Participatory researches. Modeling policy options. Modeling is being mentioned as well. Identifying scenarios, great. Yeah. So keep writing in the chat if you're unable to put the Zoom. Osama, research. Yeah, I mean, well, that's a bit general. Maybe you can specify a bit more. Yeah, I think you're writing science-based, so that's indeed evidence supported. Risk identification is being mentioned here as well. Yeah. Okay, well, this is really good. I think there's a couple of really nice examples already here. Modeling is coming by. I think that's also part of the quantitative portfolio of a foresight approach. So there's more coming in as well. Great. Okay. All right. So a lot of these things will be coming by, and please indeed feel free to keep adding as we're moving on. Great. Thanks so much, Arfa. And really great to have already these perspectives coming in as we move into the session. And once again, just to emphasize, this is really a network. So we're really interested to hear from different perspectives and different experiences all across the world. So just to get into the topic, and before I give the word to Kerstin, just a few sort of perspectives that we from Foresight for Food have seen is really critical when it comes to this very topic of food system transformation and how we strategize in that domain. So just to get you thinking, right? If you think about it very classically from a conventional strategy and policy perspective, a lot of ways in which programs, investments, development initiatives have been shaped is from a very linear perspective, right? So it's often based on certain inputs leading to certain actions, leading to certain outcomes, and then finally the goal is being achieved, which would sort of feed into the vision that's on the long term, on the horizon, basically, right? So this is a classic way in which policymakers, but also businesses, also development work has been operating in the past. But what we also see is that this offers also a challenge because it's very linear. It's often very top down. It's more inflexible and often difficult to adapt to changing circumstances, which often happen in the context of food systems. So this very idea is challenged by the very idea of how change actually occurs, right? So if you think about how change happens in a complex environment, there's all different ways, steps forward, steps back, different dynamics, different crises that emerge. And of course, you have the dynamic of people and stakeholders that are all engaging within this dynamic environment with their own interests, their own values, and their own behavior, which makes it very difficult, of course, to manage this from different perspectives. And also, this poses particular challenges to policy and governance as well. So what I'd like to just leave as a last sort of introduction is that what it's good to think about is that often the word anticipation is now coming up when it comes to policy, when it comes to complex systems. So if we talk about food systems, they're quite complex, and governance of food system transformation means that it's about dealing with complexity and uncertainty, right? We can't make linear plans. We can't make top-down sort of actions work in this domain. And therefore, it needs to be sort of dealing with a sense of anticipation, where it's about dealing with interconnected challenges in complex settings, where it's about envisioning more sustainable or better futures. And then often the question is, whose future are we then realizing? Do we agree on the future that we should all be sort of moving towards? And then what kind of pathways can there exist to take action in this complex environment? How do we monitor risks? And how can we somehow manage the dilemmas and the wicked problems that come up inevitably as we move forward and we'll never probably be able to resolve? And I think some of you mentioned already some of these challenges in the Menti when it comes to, for instance, managing short-term or long-term, breaking silos, etc. So this is what we can think about as a starting point from a policy perspective. So, and here Foresight can play a really key role, because Foresight is really about trying to navigate uncertainty, trying to understand what the future might hold, and how to inform action in the current situation. So this is really what we want to be tackling today. And we want to know how Foresight approaches can really be effective in supporting policymakers in governing transformations. And I'm really happy that Kerstin will be able to share a bit more about that. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kerstin for her keynote.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, I see many familiar faces. I guess that some people from Foster also shared, because we have a kind of joint webinar here and invited some of those colleagues. I try to share my screen. Ooh, where is it? Here, I hope. Is it in full screen from your view?
Yes, we got it.
Okay, so we can go ahead. My title is a bit misleading, maybe. It's about foresight and policy and the entry points for transforming food systems. But it's also, or even more, the entry points for policymaking. And we are not that successful in that as we want to be. But in fact, yeah, we try and we struggle. And we have a lot of experience now from the German side in BMBF, in other ministries in Germany, and especially from the European Commission side. And this is a little bit where I brought some of the projects for you and where I would like to introduce what we are doing. I'm a real practitioner, I would rather say. So my background is Japanology and Chinese studies, so completely different. I have a professorship there. But we started Foresight 32 years ago. And I'm from the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research. As nobody can pronounce it, it's easy. So this is the abbreviation in German language. And we have Fraunhofer Institutes all over the country, so all over Germany. We are run like a sports club. We are an eingetragener Verein in German. That's really like a club. So non-profit. And we have meanwhile 76 institutes seems to be the current number, but it's changing. It's changing according to what we are doing, and we are doing applied research. And we do not only have systems in our title, we also work about and with socio-technical systems and innovation systems. We try to transform these kind of social technical systems or help people to do that. We do a lot of foresight and other policy measures in the different departments that we have. We have departments around sustainability, around energy. We have more about innovation and knowledge economy, so around all that. And I'm here. We have the Department of Foresight, and I'm in the Foresight for Research and Civil Society. That means I started with a lot of technology and research and foresight on that. But now we are having a look at the full picture, or especially the linkage between science, technology, innovation, and the society. And of course, what research is playing, the role research and policymakers in research are playing as their roles. I would like to start with what is foresight, because everyone has a different definition of foresight. We have already heard one, and ours is close to what you've already heard from Bram. We are working with futures. So we are not predicting the future. We are not directly planning. We are trying with a long and medium-term view to have a structured debate about complex futures. And futures are always complex. That means we need a systematic and methodologically based approach. So different methods that are combined. And we cannot do it alone. And this is why we need participation, but not only participation of civil society, we also need the participation of our policymakers or of those on the way to our policymakers to let them know what we are thinking. So it's not that easy to say we only have expert foresight. That was the start, but now we are completely different. And of course, you see that there are many different notions on foresight and expressions, how we title the whole endeavor. And I always remind people that we have different futures ahead, and we are not only anticipating. That's why I do not use anticipation that much, because anticipation always starts in the now. From the now, we see possible futures. We see a lot of likely or more or less probable futures, which is very difficult to assess. And we see desirable or preferred futures. But what we have to do, and what we are doing much more, is work back from the desirable and preferred futures once we have identified what is desirable and preferred for whom. So these might be different people in the whole game. And foresight has a lot of objectives. The objectives of foresight can just be awareness raising, stretch your brain to explore some new futures, up to really strategizing, making really policy strategies and have measures to be taken in the end and recommendations to really start to make things happen. But that depends on the project you are in, that depends on the system you are looking at, and that depends on your approach. So you cannot just say, I strategize that I start doing something here in the system. You never know how the system behaves. The system might behave in a completely different way than you expected. But what is very important is once you have your objectives, do not use all of the foresight objectives. Make it clear what is your goal. Set clear targets for your work in foresight and communicate that to the policymakers or to those who are your project managers, because that is also very important. And we love to talk about biases and mental filters, but I leave it out here today because we all have our mental filters and see systems of the future completely different, from a different perspective, in a different way. But the way we see them distort our information bias, distort what we are looking at, and distort our decisions. And therefore, it's very important to look also at our biases. We have more groups of biases. You can read that in publications. It's not so important, but I would like to remind you that some things are always there that we do not want to see. And we cannot eliminate our filters, but we can try to open them up and work with them. What I would like to introduce today is a little bit of foresight cycle that was built up in a group that was called EFLA, European Forum of Forward-Looking Activities of the European Commission. I was part of that, and we took over a kind of policy cycle and a kind of foresight cycle and mixed that all into one game. And we came up with a cycle of projects or of approaches in foresight that help a lot if you follow these lines a little bit. So that means, of course, at first you need to know what's going on now. What's the state of the art in my question? So if you are talking about the house of the future or the food system of the future, you should know a little bit how it is now. And even that is quite complicated to describe. Then what is called here strategic intelligence is the outlook, looking what is lying ahead, then making sense of it, evaluating it, setting priorities, select priorities from that, and then go forward to your desirable future and to the implementation. Make it real. And that's the most difficult thing, because here you have to convince others to go with you on the way. We have many, many different methods in foresight. I don't go through this list. This is only one list and a second list of methods that we used in our institute, and there are many, many more. And this is only our systematization. So you see there are a lot of methods around. But what is very important is this is the same cycle as I've already presented, but it starts here on the left-hand side and leaves out the state of the art. You have to be very careful what you are doing when and what kind of methods you use and when. Because this is already a part of the game of the entrance point into your food system. If you have methods that are too far away from the food system or that are not useful in that context, then don't use them. And make a clear way, a clear process out of it. This is very, very important in order to end here with the implementation and to take people on board. We've already heard about participation. The best thing, the best foresight process is where you have people participated in. And sometimes it's possible to have even policymakers in or people from the commission, even the administration from the commission, and they help you then to bring things forward. But it's not always the case, and we cannot invite the whole world to our processes. So we always have only few people on board, but it's often quite interesting to keep at least those informed about the processes we are handling that have to do the implementation later, or that have to do the selection, the decisions in the whole policy cycle. Means at first we scan the environment, then we look deeper into it, we judge it, we select. And here it's not only that we have votings, we can also do that at workshops, in discussions, with scenarios and so on. And here we go to the action phase again. And I guess it's difficult to believe me, and theory is also something very boring. So I brought some examples where we have entry points into the system. And one example is a project. The first example is called Bohemia. That is Beyond the Horizon, Foresight in Support of the Preparation of the EU's Future Policy in Research and Innovation. In fact, this was a project before Horizon Europe, the big program, the big RTDI program of the European Commission was launched. And this was an input into that, a real input. And for the first time, it had its influence. This project was a combination of scenarios and a Delphi survey. So we had big scenarios, meta scenarios, a Delphi survey, selected topics from the Delphi survey, had a lot of discussions, had a lot of horizon scanning before, of course, in order to bring in what we might need, had a lot of horizon scanning afterwards, after the Delphi 2, grouped that, and came out with not only possible futures, as here, we also came out with targeted scenarios. So we had a last consultation where we asked for what is really desirable in the next Horizon Europe. At that time, it was Framework Program 9. So we did not have any word for that. But now it's Horizon Europe. And we figured out some targeted scenarios. And there was not much about food systems. I looked it up, but I found bioeconomy. And especially here also for zero hunger. We connected it with the SDGs, and this one was one of the inputs. There were 17 of these kind of scenarios as an input. So this was example 1. So just the project, and it entered into policymaking. Then there is the Standing Committee of Agricultural Research for the European Commission and their research in agriculture. So this has a lot to do with food systems. And this is already a really long-standing committee. This exists for a long, long time. And this SCAR, started in 2005 into Foresight exercises. I was at the very first one, then I was not so much involved in that, but I entered it once more for the 5th Foresight in 2020 that was published in 2020. And here you have an expert group. So this entry point is an expert group advising the European Commission. And this expert group is a part of the SCAR, and SCAR has members from all countries of the European Commission. That means this is an entry point from all member states, but it's also an entry point from the Foresight point of view, using really a methodology to bring these people together. And we invited many people to our workshops. If I report from the 2020, the 5th SCAR, the 6th SCAR will start soon. We are just waiting for the contract, and this time it will be different. It will be a project like Bohemia. But here it was still an expert group. So this expert group, the people as such, brought in their expertise, but methodologically, they also worked back and forth in time. And this time they started with desirable futures. Here we started backwards with the SDGs. And together with policymakers and many other experts, we defined targets derived from the SDGs, not only from zero hunger. That was a mix, but still in agriculture and food systems. We worked out many other things, key factors, like in scenarios, but we still worked like in roadmaps on a timeline. We defined meta trends, small trends, found data, mixed all that, had a lot of recommendations in between, and came up with 3 big issues that have to be addressed in food systems. That's healthy diet, circularity in the food system, and biodiversity. And we worked on them, how we can achieve these goals together with a bulk of actors in different workshops. And this is how we did it in theory. So we had a lot of transition points and mentioned all that and described it. And the narrative came also out. So we made a narrative out of it. We had a journalist to write a story on it. But this was the reality, as you can imagine. So this is how it looks like if you really work in a workshop. And this was, for example, for the circularity one on food loss prevention and what has to go into that. So this is reality. A third example as an entry point is scenario work. general, normal scenario work. Take people on board in scenarios. So do not only use software, then the software is calculating the scenarios and you just give an input. But scenarios means in our case that we are co-creating the images. We are co-creating the scenarios of possible futures. Here we are not in the desirable futures, we're in possible futures, having an outlook on what might happen and what are the combinations that really culminate in an image. So what are the images of our food system in the future? And here we start with key factors of change, identify what is really the skeleton of our scenarios. We have alternative assumptions for these factors, sometimes with a tetralemma approach. Some of the Foster people already know that. We worked with that also in a summer school. And then work out consistent combinations of projections or assumptions or options, whatever terminology you use. We are relatively flexible on that. It works like this. You can really work on a mural or mirror or whatever board, concept board, whatever you like. But it needs to be systematic and it needs to be open. So you work here at first, figure out the factors, have different assumptions on it, have an influence matrix or consistency matrix to see what influences what most, have a starter. And if we are doing it in a scenario sprint, then you have the most influential factors at the beginning, and they often split your scenarios, your different pictures of the future. But the reality of the sprint then looks like this. And you have different combinations of assumptions that all culminate in one picture then. For example, the red line, the blue line, the green line, and the and what do we also have? Yeah, and the black one. We also had a yellow one in addition. And this is the real picture from Foster, from our Foster scenarios in food systems. We came out with 4 scenarios, and as the rule is normally only to put one of the assumptions, one assumption once into the scenarios, so to really make different pictures, we added 2 other scenarios on request because we could not take the assumptions that others had already addressed, and then some completely different scenarios came out. But the learnings for and with policymakers in these are the scenarios that came out. That's already published, you can read that. But these different scenarios have to be used. And in one, these were the post-COVID scenarios. We had a sense-making workshop with policymakers. So discuss with them, what does it mean for you? So what does it mean for future policies? And in the Foster, for example, we are still working with the scenarios, putting our cases, CDIs, we call them change-driven initiatives, into the scenarios and see what's happening with their specific targets, with their roadmaps, and with their options. So what is the most interesting thing with scenarios is you can think of being in a completely different place. You can even do a mental time traveling into these scenarios and look around in these different worlds and see what might be strategies to cope with this world or to fight this world or whatever. So don't forget that. And the last way of doing it is directly. We have a series of projects in a framework contract that is called Foresight on Demand. Means they are really demanding. And the commission is saying, the commission or an agency of the commission says that they want this and that and this and foresight on different issues. It can be on on food systems, it can be on AI. We start now one, and we start the new SCAR Foresight also under this headline. And they provide some money, but they have to be very quick. They have to be very fast. So they are on demand and they have an end normally within 1 year or even less sometimes. And the second row is starting now. And we already, the yellow ones were, these are not from not all of them are from the Foresight on Demand. But what we noticed then during these different projects, that we more and more convinced the policymakers or the project officers of the European Commission, as they have a network in the Commission for foresighters, we convinced them to participate in our projects. Bohemia was the first time. We really had to convince them, but then they had so much fun that they now come back. And even, well, with the new commission, we don't know, but we will start again and try to get them on board, because they bring, and these are the Foresight on Demand projects, they bring all the ideas we have generated here back to their departments, back to the policymakers, back into the European Commission. And this is different between the extent of participation. So are they directly in, or are the projects just open to everyone? If they are just open to everyone, then it's difficult to convince the policymakers to take it on board. But if they are really participating, then they are in the scenarios, then they are in all these projects, and they take it with them. So that means internal processes and participatory processes are a bit easier to get into the game and really make change. Some lessons learned. These are the last slides, so no worry. Our lessons learned, especially from the Foresight on Demand, is that methodological approaches that include these officers are very helpful, not only to make them aware, but also to really work with them and make them take away also some results and bring that into the game. Especially that is called, this Foresight network is called Horizon Foresight Network now, but it will be a kind of strategic Foresight network for the next periods of time, but we will still go on to work with them. They are really good as multipliers. And to get an entry point is easier if you have multipliers, or if you have a promoter, someone who is really convinced that it's good what you're doing. What is definitely good is a combination of methods, and not only have always scenarios, always this, always Delphi. So have a combination of methods and adapt them to the needs of your client or whoever is the policymaker. But what we also noticed that more time is often needed in the projects, especially when compared to the calls, but also because it's not us as the organizers who have no time. It's also those who want to participate who have no time, and they also need to be on board. So the project officers and the policymakers and so on. And you need the time to digest the findings, because often you hand over the results and then there's nobody to really have a look at it and digest it really. Well, and the food for thought for you is there is different forms of usages and different forms of entry points into food systems and entry points into the policymaking for food systems. From the methodological point of view, it's very important that you are open at the beginning, that you look for possible futures, and then close it down and make a sense-making and evaluation. So don't restrict yourself, even if policymakers are only responsible for a certain part of it. What helps are roadmaps or just timelines for as the interface between foresight and the policy planning, to differentiate very much between possible and desirable futures and have this kind of normative clarity. And what is also important is exploring the alternative contexts as the basis for then their strategies or their new policies. Include many stakeholders if possible, or at least those you want to have on board later for your change. And that helps a lot for future-proofing of policy and thematic proposals, if people are set into different futures, into different scenarios, even different big pictures. So we have a lot of good experiences with more embedding and more participation, but timing is key in the policy processes. So if you come out with your results just before elections, then you can just throw them in the bin. Then they are gone. So you have to take them on board and give them to your new policymakers on board. So this is my recommendation: time your processes also well.
Great. Thanks a lot, Kirsten. I think that's super interesting. And I think that range of experiences gives a lot of richness to all the different ways in which Foresight's being used. And I can imagine there's a few questions maybe also from the room. But I'd like to also ask Monica for a quick response in terms of, how you see the presentation of Kirsten. I mean, you're involved in both the Foresight for Food as well as the Foster, right? So I'm very happy to have you respond. And then I think we have a few questions from the room as well. So we have a bit of time for that. But Monica, you can kick off, and then I'll give the word to someone else.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kerstin, for your presentation. And again, really fascinating. And I think a lot of your conclusions are spot on. Also similar to the learnings that we have in the Foresight for Food initiative. I think one of the questions or issues that often comes up is, are we overpromising sometimes with Foresight, and what we can deliver and how. And I do think your points about embedding Foresight really into the policymaking processes is key. That, of course, and that's where my question is, makes it difficult because you mentioned the issue of time and timing. So any advice, any thoughts on how to get it right? Because most of us are not embedded in that sense in the particular organization with whom we're working. You said already we need some kind of a champion internally that helps us basically to open the door to the key decision makers. Is there then a way of how we can ensure that the relevance of the particular methods that we might be using is also understood by the respective policymakers? Do we need something like more foresight literacy in a lot of policymaking bodies to better understand what foresight can do, what scenarios can do versus a 3-horizon framework versus horizon scanning? And how can we create that link between the foresight practitioners, again, that are often sitting outside the institutions, and the real foresight users more strongly? What would be your recommendation to get the time and the timings right, which I think I totally agree with you is absolutely key to get these two issues sorted in order to have real policy impact?
Thanks for that question, Monica. Before you jump in, Kristen, I'd just like to highlight that Minke, you posted a question also in the chat, which is about the integration of systems thinking within, or systems approach within your research. Do you use systems mapping, etc., in your work? Would you be able to also respond to that next to the question of Monica? And then we'll go to Nasser and Charlotte.
Yes, the first question is, are we overpromising? We try to keep really both legs on the earth. So we try to really tell people what is possible and what is not possible, often more what is not possible. And policymakers, they expect quick decisions. They expect short-term thinking, and they expect that we tell them, this is the future and you have to do this and that and this and that. So you always need a lot of explanation at the beginning, and definitely we need more foresight literacy also among policymakers, but also among other people during the course before. The problem is that we often even do not reach these people before. So this kind of entrance point to these people is already blocked. And there you often need this kind of internal champions, or you need some people who are the promoters of the system, who know foresight, who are foresight literate, who know what the limits are, who have connections into networks. And therefore, many of these kind of expert commissions help getting into these networks, or these kind of promoters help to get into these networks and get connected to policy making and policymakers. Or you start at the bottom of an institution, an organization like the European Union or the European Commission, and try to institutionalize it. But this is really a long-term endeavor, and we are not really successful in that. And what is also very important, people are changing all the time. And that hampers a lot these kind of entrance doors. And you also do not want that the policymakers recommend to themselves. So this kind of self-recommendation is like self-lobbying and bringing back their biases just to the fore. And this is not what we want. So this is quite difficult. And you have really to be always aware of that. And that's the same with the systems. So integrating systems and systems thinking is very difficult, because even if you map the systems and you do this kind of time work on the systems, you can only have a look at a small part of the system. And you never know if another part of the system is changing completely at that point in time when you change your point A. So this really needs a long time foresight through the system to see what's happening when you just change something at the beginning. So put one point in at the beginning and test it. And Foresight is also there to make a kind of thought experiment on that in the systems. Difficult, but possible. And here, sometimes even systems thinking is quite helpful. And sometimes you can even use models for that.
Thanks. And I think really good response about, choices, right? You have to make in this regard. Okay, so I think there's 3 hands, and try to make your questions succinct if possible, short. So Nasser, then Charlotte, then Arazu.
My name is Nasser Reyhani from Leibniz Institute, ATB in Germany. Thank you very much, Kerstin, for this fantastic presentation. Along with the question on system thinking, dealing with complex systems like food system, this cross-sectoral trade-offs, synergies, and co-benefits, it's becoming a very hot topic, dealing with other sectors like health, environment, with society, with energy, with water, soil, and it's a complex system. So at what stage of foresight do you see the importance of setting a promising system boundary which defines inclusion of right people at right stage, and to also ensure their ownership, and later to really reach to a robust foresight outputs where could already reflect on other sectors are interconnected with food system? That's the first question. And second, a brief question, how do you think the importance or the potential contribution of large language models, AI, and those upcoming ones supporting foresight? Thank you.
Nice, thanks a lot, Nasser. So indeed, inclusion, scope, and the question of AI. Shall we keep collecting the questions and then we respond? Charlotte?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. I'm from the Austrian Ministry for Climate Action, working on sustainable food systems. So I'm quite familiar with the systems approach, but foresight is a bit new to me, I have to say. I found it very interesting what you mentioned in the differentiation of possible and desirable futures, and I wonder how this is really applied in practice, as I imagine desirable is very subjective and an individual thinking, and food systems are so complex, and bringing all these stakeholders together might range, the desirable ideas might range from very different scenarios that people might have in mind. So I don't know if I really got, or if the approach also includes an approach to tackle that problem of this big spectrum. And the other very simple question would be, as this seems more, it comes from a rather scientific background, under which German word could this approach be known? Just because I work in Austria, could colleagues and others know this approach if they don't apply it in the more scientific field? Or if not, then there is just no German word, but out of curiosity. Thank you.
Nice. I'm sure that both Monica and Kerstin will be able to say something about that one. Okay, let's have one last question from Arazu, and I'm collecting also the questions, so we'll be able to capture all of them, hopefully. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have just a short question about time horizon. And at first I should introduce myself a bit. My name is Arazu Babajani, and I'm working at the University of Hohenheim. And about time horizon, I would like to know, how do you determine time horizon for your projects? Maybe an example would be FOSTER project, because I think for scenario planning, the time horizon will influence the scenario outcomes, in fact. Thank you very much.
Yeah, very interesting question. Huh? So how far into the future do you go with these things? Okay, so I mean, we've got a couple of nice questions. So maybe, Kerstin, do you want to take a few of them? Either the inclusion scope question about large language models, the tension between desirable and plausible futures, the German word for this whole thing, and the issue of time horizon. Maybe you take a few and then Monica responds to a few.
Yeah. So the easiest one, the German word is Vorausschau, and that's why we often use Foresight. Even the BMBF, the German Ministry for Research and Education, had an agency to find a new word. In the end, they came up with Foresight, because Vorausschau is often close to Vorschau, and Vorschau is prognosis. It's really prediction. And not to mix it up, we use rather the English word. Some say strategic foresight or strategische Vorausschau. That's what the ministries are doing. We say it's the strategy is inherent, so in foresight, so we don't need that word. And you need the foresight first and then a strategy, and not strategic first and then foresight. That's why we use this kind of terminology. The time horizon is very different for each project. You can even go for 1,000 years, but then sometimes it does not make sense anymore. For the FOSTER, we have chosen 2040, especially for the scenarios, to really bring those initiatives that we are talking about in FOSTER, in the project FOSTER, in food systems, to a longer view, and really to make them think a little bit longer than their normal thinking is. And in Bohemia, it was even easier. We had the time horizon of 2038. Why that? Because then all projects of Horizon Europe, the Foresight program, the research program of the European Commission, will end. And that means in 2038, we need to have it on board, or we have to have it achieved, or all the projects are kind of failure and overpromised somehow. And a last question from NASA. AI tools. Yes, we experiment all with AI tools. They seem to be very promising in summarizing things, in finding single data, or in bringing us to new ideas at certain points in time. That means until now, we only use them for single activities in our foresight processes. We will in the next couple of months, we will test a full range scenario process with AI tools in comparison to our normal scenario sprint. But I have to admit that I'm very disappointed now with all these AI tools, because they do not have real human thinking inside. And whenever you have to value something, or whenever there are connections beyond technology and research, then they get lost and tell you some nonsense, or and they do not provide any good sources, especially in horizon scanning. If you're doing horizon scanning, then the sources are just sometimes invented.
Yeah, thanks.
Monica.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, Monica, you can jump in with these, maybe some also responses to the other questions.
Sure. I mean, on the question of AI or
Oh, we can't hear you very well. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Is it better now? Is it better?
It's a bit muffled.
sorry, it might be a problem on my computer. So on the issue of AI, I couldn't agree more with Kerstin that you know, though it looks promising, at the end, it's about, particularly if we use it for policy making, it's about changing ideas and mindsets about what the future could look like. That's for me a big part of the power of foresight. So then the question is, and it comes back to what Kerstin said earlier, how much can we involve the people that are actually taking the decisions in this whole process? Because a secondary effect of a lot of foresight processes is that there's kind of mutual learning going on across different people that are part of the process, which of course you wouldn't have if you do it either completely expert driven. I think this is expert scenarios or modeling based scenarios have an important value in terms of awareness raising. But if you really want to have people involved in changing their thinking about the future, then you need people to be an integral part of the process itself, I find.
Yeah.
And I think that goes along with what Kerstin had said. So then the question is, how do you kick off this kind of learning process? And what can AI or other modeling-based tools bring to the table versus conversations and challenging each other in a number of workshops? And I think there's value in both. Both can be used together very nicely, but we need to not forget of how important the conversations are that are happening as part of a lot of the kind of processes that Kerstin just described. So I just wanted to bring
Sorry,
that
Monica,
up.
you're a little bit muffled, so I'm just jumping in because it's also giving tension on your voice perhaps as well, so I don't want to have that as well. But I think the issue of inclusion is therefore also critical, what you're also saying, like how do you involve people and get people into a learning stage, and having that diversity of voices is just really critical if you want this process to be effective. Maybe just giving back the word to Kerstin for that last question. I think we didn't touch upon that. What about this tension between the desirable and the plausible? And I think that's one of those things that I think policymakers might sort of be, on the one hand, very much focused on sort of having that desirable future and saying, you know, how do we get there? And on the other hand, saying, you know, make it as realistic as possible and give me some, you know, probabilities like someone's already mentioned in the chat. Kerstin, what is your experience with these kind of discussions on this?
The experience is that you're fully right that what is desirable for one, it might not be desirable for others and might be really a disadvantage for others. This is one thing, but my experience is rather that policymakers don't listen. Even if everyone says this is a desirable future and we need to change something, at a point in time when you say, okay, here is something that has to change and that needs some endeavor, that needs some something to do, really, really hard work sometimes, or you have to sacrifice something. So something is completely different in the future. Then they don't do that. Then they don't go for this kind of desirable future and take just their own ideas on board and forget about what all foresighters tell these people. So this is really, really crucial that one insists on some of these points. Well, we know a lot of these that are around climate change and whatever, and people really forget that. And then if this is not done, and if this is not always put on the table again and again and again, it's not only that we foresighters get depressed, but it's also that some really powerful people take their own visions on board and make them real. And then they, well, set the pace already for others, for all others. We see it in the United States currently, when Musk is really pushing his visions on the whole country. And this is the desirable future of one person. It's not the desirable future of all of them. And therefore, it is difficult, but democratic processes are there to elect their policymakers and to bring those policymakers to the forefront who go with these desirable futures of the many. So it has a lot to do with democratic processes. It has a lot to do also with, that's what Nasser said, the interdisciplinary intersectoral, cross-sectoral processes too. So take on board also the other, not only disciplines, but also the other sectors that are involved, like in health or wherever.
Yeah, super. This is really nice. And I think this is really coming to the core of a lot of the things that we're doing, right? And I think Foresight is both a methodology and an approach, right? But it's also quite, touching on value systems, touching on political dynamics as well. Okay, great. So thanks a lot for this discussion.
Just a quick one, if it's possible.
Okay, yeah, awesome. Please.
Yeah, my question is, from your vast experiences, how did you quantify and show trade-offs, and what's the best ways to do it in a way for the policymakers to really make sense of it?
That's really a problem that policymakers always need a quantified number. And we are not so good in really quantifying things. We can say it's big, it's not so big. We can put ranges on that. We can calculate. We can extrapolate with models more and more. But we cannot say that this will be the future. We can only say this is an assumption. And if you do this, then, for example, this and that figure explodes. So one has to be very, very careful with figures. But sometimes you're right. When possible, we also use figures just to raise awareness with policymakers. Otherwise, they don't believe you if you are just describing things.
Yeah.
Or sometimes that doesn't work, and very critical issues to say at least the direction you're going towards is the problematic or catastrophic.
Exactly.
Okay.
Nice. Thanks, Asim. Okay, I want to have a bit of time for us to really exchange a bit in small subgroups. I think this is a really good discussion, but we can come back and also have a bit more sharing at the end. So let me just share my screen for the exercise. Oh, sorry. I should give the word first to Deepika, who will introduce a bit more sort of the background research that she is doing, especially focusing on literature, on food systems and foresight, but also bringing up the case of Bangladesh. Deepika, go ahead.
Yes.
Please put full slide, please.
Yeah. I hope it's full screen now.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Bram. Hi, everyone. I'm Deepika Manoharan from Wageningen Socio-Economic Research and Foresight for Food Initiative. I will be sharing with you what I've been working on, basically, from the time of my internship. This kind of ties in with what Kerstin and Monica were talking about. So they were talking about the analysis and the foresight processes, and I will be reflecting on giving you some insights on the reflection of this in literature. So what I was working on was sharing key updates with you from foresight literature, existing literature right now. So let's get into it. So what I was trying to understand was to really look at how foresight insights are used to inform food policies. So very much about, we have all these processes, but how do we feed it back into the policy landscape? And I was trying to answer this by looking at a study of 154 odd database. So that was from the Foresight for Food database, which I then narrowed down to 11 studies. And how I did this was basically from a detection method. I asked questions such as, does the study focus on food systems and agriculture? Does it provide policy recommendations? And does it use foresight tools? If so, what type? And so on and so forth. So the idea behind it is to really understand what kind of studies and what kind of tools and where they were applied and for when, so that it's easier to then be able to apply it into the policy landscape.
So like I said, I asked questions such as, does the study focus on food and agriculture and so forth? So if you can look at the table here, a lot of the studies that said yes to most of these categorizations were then focused. So that is how we arrived down to the 11 studies. So the 11 studies that were focused were then further analyzed. And here on the right, you can see some of the questions that I had asked on the table, such as, does the study use Foresight tools, and do the outcomes, are they implemented or not from the Foresight process? So, and further for the 11 questions, I asked questions such as, what type of policymakers were involved? What ministries were they from, and at what levels do they operate? And also, how were policymakers involved? Were they involved with bilateral meetings? Were they involved by exploratory workshops, or was it rather a normative interview? So about the process, really. And finally, also, how was the result of the Foresight process shared? Was it by a report? Was it a policy brief? Or was it a short plenary session at the end of the Foresight process? So I heard also Kerstin talking about how sharing the results is an important part of the process. And so let's see how that reflects in the analysis that I've had. So some of the initial findings that have popped up, and this is of course an ongoing analysis and it's still happening. So these are just some of the emerging trends currently. So one of them is that multi-stakeholder foresight processes are a very common practice in all of the studies that I'm looking at. And who gets invited to the processes are mostly policymakers, academics, NGOs, civil society organizations, and sometimes even private sector. And what's interesting is that there's little to no information available on the process itself and how the outcomes are used and how they are then embedded into the policy landscape. So this is something that we're trying to answer right now. And to this 150 studies, we're further adding more literature from databases such as Scopus and ScienceDirect. And how we narrowed down these studies is by picking out a few terminologies based on Boolean search, which yielded again about 200 to 300 studies. So this analysis is ongoing, and we'll be happy to share with you once it's done. So now these are some of the emerging trends in the overall existing foresight process. And it can also be a question for the audience. What are some of the questions that appear in the practitioner's mind while they're going through these processes? Do they think about who is invited to the process and how that navigates the conversation, and what are the insights that they bring in? So these are some of the questions that are also nice to think about during the processes. So to take a little bit of a zoomed in approach on this, I will now give you an example of the Bangladesh case study. So Foresight for Food Systems Transformation also works with Bangladesh in helping them align their food systems landscape with the UNFSS pathway. So how we did that is basically, I did a short policy scoping of the landscape, policy landscape. And so here you can look at the table of the existing policy documents in Bangladesh that relate to food policy. And then I juxtaposed it with the 5 action areas of the UNFSS pathway. And they have a few themes, 11 or 10 themes. And I tried to look at which of the action areas and themes are already occurring in the existing policy landscape of Bangladesh. And so you can see here that the boxes that are covered in green are covered, and the ones that are in red are not, and the ones in orange are partly covered. So when the Foresight practitioner or whoever looks at this table, this traffic light table, they have an idea of where they need to focus more in order to align their existing landscape with food systems, UNFSS pathways. So this is just to give you a little example of how Foresight insights are used in the process itself, and hopefully this helps you in the engagement that we will have now in the breakout rooms. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks a lot, Deepika. And I think this is really interesting, right? Because it shows that there is a lot of work being done in this space, and yet there are still a lot of questions that emerge from it as well. I'm also looking at a bit time, because I'm also wondering, like, there is a short time for us to break out into groups, but I'm also wondering, seeing the questions that are emerging and the expertise that we have in the room, I'm just wondering whether it's also just nice to have a bit of a discussion together. And I think I'd like to just welcome everyone to just contribute right now, because I think maybe that's also a nice way to use the remaining time left to us. I hope that's okay with everyone. Also in terms of time, it is nice to be able to dig into the group work, but now I'm also worried that that might be a bit short for you all to engage. Are there any questions that emerge based on Deepika's thinking? I mean, I think Deepika's presentation, she was asking, like, what is the role of bringing a lot of people in the room versus, how does the process actually work? I think that's a really interesting discussion to have. And I think we've got a lot of different country experiences here to share on this as well. I'm thinking if there's anyone who wants to jump in, feel free to raise your hand, and we can give you the floor. I think there's also some observations and questions in the chat that we can also still address also. Okay, I see Asim. Yeah, you're holding up your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah. I place a lot of importance on the participants, the participation, and on the participants being from a minimum level within their respective ministries and organizations. Sometimes you get participants, but they really are not decision makers, or they don't have the real depth to contribute efficiently. This is one thing. The other thing, I'm talking about a very brief history, because I'm involved in Foresight for the past 2 years, and then just recently I made the background study and blueprint for convergence initiative between food system transformation and climate action for Jordan. And even I was surprised of the amounts of strategies and action plans in other ministries. So I was aware of the ones with the Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Water, to some extent health, and a bit about the environment. But in the environment scape, they have a lot. And then the Ministry of Social Development, disaster risk reduction. And I was really surprised when I dug deeply how many, let's say, depth of information that was out there, and that needs coordination between the relevant ministries and entities involved in such foresight. So you definitely need to do a very extensive exercise. So in the case of Bangladesh, what our colleague presented, and it needs really deep thinking to see how much the existing ones are coordinated. And with existing knowledge that we have, how much coordination and how much of that goes into actually doing work on the ground, and the next thing, planning is nice and having foresight. We need to have mechanisms in order to try to implement it on the ground, and this is major for me.
Yeah. Really nice reflection from Jordan Assam. I think it's really nice, and what you're saying also, indeed, that there's so much happening in all these different spaces that it's almost like a huge task to even align across those different spaces also. Really nice. Theo, you've got your hands raised. Feel free to unmute and share your question or a comment.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to respond to Deepika's presentation. particularly around stakeholders, because I think it's interesting to think about who isn't there in that list that she shared. I wanted to ask a question about involving citizens in foresight, and the challenges and kind of opportunities that surround doing so. Thank you.
Yeah, really nice. And I think that's a really good point. We talk about stakeholders in the food system, right? But in the end, we're all citizens. We're all within that country, we're all in that context. So Deepika, do you want to respond? And maybe I would invite Kerstin and Monica to add as well, if you want to add. Yeah.
Yeah, I can shortly reflect on what I've been observing from the data set that I have. That's actually a very interesting question, Theo, and it also adds to the discussion that they were talking about whose desired future is it. So it really matters on who are all the participants that are in the foresight process. And currently the challenges that I am seeing that these processes talk about in involving people from different backgrounds, especially citizens and different backgrounds, is when they're all in the room together, there's a very massive supposedly a very massive epistemological difference. So one might be an academic and the other might be a citizen who's very much out of this academic bubble. So how do we conduct a foresight process that will involve everyone? And so that is something currently emerging as one of the very big challenges that I'm observing in literature.
Yeah, really nice response. And indeed, I think there's also this whole domain of, for instance, citizens' assemblies that are also coming up, which are also perhaps using tools of foresight in order to tackle complex issues like climate change or AI as well. So that's also emerging. I also like to perhaps give the word to, okay, Monica, you can respond to the comment. And then I would like to ask maybe Minke, if you would like to say something, right? Because you've been very actively typing, but I'd like to also hear from you, perhaps. What are your thoughts? Monica, you can go first.
Oh, I just wanted to respond that I think no foresight process can work well if you don't also have careful facilitation. And I think that is definitely something that if foresight processes are carried out, even if it's, let's say, among academics, when we come from very different backgrounds, and it's the same if you bring in much broader group of stakeholders, I think paying a lot of attention to the facilitation of the process, I think is really, really important in order to have good results that everybody can kind of work with. But as Deepika's research shows, often there's very little documentation of these processes and what worked and what not. And for me, as a foresight process practitioner, sometimes the process is more important than the actual outcomes because of the learnings that I mentioned earlier and the discussions that people are having about changing underlying ideas about plausible futures, really. And so I do think we cannot be careful enough and pay enough attention to the process of doing the foresight as much as the methods and who's involved, in addition to what comes out of it. So I think the two really go hand in hand, and we need to be very careful in managing that.
Yeah, very nice. Minke, do you want to come in?
I'm putting me on the spot here, Bram, but thank you so much.
I know you can
have an
handle
awful
it.
cold, so it's my voice is a bit harsh, but if you bear with me. But thank you so much, Bram, for organizing and for the speakers for their excellent presentation. I'm definitely not a food systems expert. I work at the United Nations Global Pulse. Probably you don't know it. It's based in Finland, but it's the experimentation lab for the Secretary General, and I work specifically as a foresight specialist here. So we try to help integrate foresight and embed foresight and land foresight in the UN system. And I say specifically embedding and landing foresight, it's not just a toolbox that we hand out to their UN colleagues, but it's really about that mindset shift and the culture shift that needs to happen when you integrate foresight. And I was specifically interested in how what your experiences are with combining systems thinking and foresight, because you can imagine like the complexity of the issues that the UN has to tackle and the different colleagues have to tackle. It's that you really need that systems lens, while still foresight is very new to many people. So it's how to combine both approaches in a way that is actually manageable for people, right? It's an extra tool that we have to bring to where people have to work with above everything else that they have to struggle with already. So it's how to do that in a kind of an accessible way. But I also wanted to maybe respond to a previous question about how to engage citizens. I'm based in Finland. I'm not a Finn. I'm Dutch, as Bram, but I'm very inspired here always by the Finnish system. They have a foresight tradition that goes back to like the 70s or so. They have a standing committee here in Parliament that is the Committee for the Future. So they constantly engage in foresight research. And basically, before every new government takes seat, they do this extensive foresight process, and they engage, and they go basically to Lapland and to. It's a big country compared to the Netherlands, so it's they really go everywhere and involve citizens in a very accessible way. So even if you can talk to the differences in their experiences, but there's still a lot of opportunities and best practices here of how to involve citizens in the process. So, but thanks again for this excellent presentation.
Thanks, Minke. And these are really nice reflections. I think the challenge that you are indeed tackling with integrating foresight within the UN is a big one and a huge one. And I think the whole initiative around UN 2.0, which really takes foresight as one of those pillars of what the UN needs to do and know, is really interesting. And thanks also for reminding us about the example of Finland, because I think there we have a very nice national-based example about how to integrate foresight in all different, participatory governance decision-making as well. And I think that's really nice. So I think that's a really good contribution. Okay, so you already, I think, mentioned a few really nice things. Okay, Dennis, you've raised your hand. Please come in.
Thank you, Brahms and colleagues. I would just like to react to Deepika's presentation, specifically on assessing the integration of foresight into the UNFSS. The last illustration she provided, where she juxtaposed the UNFSS focus areas against the current policy landscape in Bangladesh, was an interesting one, because I think it gives us a nice beginning point to look at areas where foresight has been used, although the challenge that remains is trying to understand the extent to which foresight has been, say, applied. For instance, yes, they could have used this foresight approach, but to what extent? Is it? Can we then look at the text and be able to analyze the variations in the extent to which the policy text aligns with the UNFSS pathways? So, are we able to tease out the depth to which maybe foresight has been used, and come up with say, some kind of guiding document or guidance to maybe future policy developers hoping to use foresight on the things that they have to focus on to be better than the policy documents that were probably passed in the past previously. So my idea is to look: is there a way we can base off this current work to guide on more extensive use and more like complete application of foresight?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. And you're coming in from the Uganda perspective, right? I think this is also good to mention, right? And I think what you're mentioning is interesting, right? So what in what ways is Foresight really also, you know, becoming part of the language that that policies and strategies are using as well. And I think that's actually an interesting one. Maybe Kerstin, do you want to say something about language and how that should come back in sort of, yeah, policies themselves? Is that something that you see as what happens, or is that something that you think is not really yeah, happening a lot?
Language is a really big issue in Foresight. It frames your questions, your solutions, your topics that you're talking about. And of course, Dennis, what you were talking about is making use of what is already existing. There are a lot of policy papers, and there's a lot of horizon scanning issues, and what people already found out about futures, different futures, future assumptions, and so on and so on. So you can make use of that, but for you, for your specific purpose, for your country, for the UN, you need to frame it in your language. And you have to frame it in the way that you in your language understand it. And that's why we often in Foresight, even if you have European projects or international projects, we work in the specific language in the country, of the country. And even if we do Delphi surveys, we often translated the Delphi topics. And Delphi topics, Delphi is a specific survey tool to not reach consensus, but to find out if people are in a major thinking, in the same thinking, or if they completely diverge, and so on and so on. But for that, and here we are back to the system, you have to frame it in a way that it's just one assumption. So you have to set your boundary to a specific problem, a specific thesis, topic, and bring it to the point, and then make it judge, and then fit it back to the system. And that has to do a lot with framing and with language. Not only different languages, but also in English, to frame a new language, to frame a new word. My very first Foresight process or project was about project proposals that were handed in with different words. So one was a neurocomputer, one was a computer network, and one was a different expression, but it was the same project. It was handed in under different synonyms, under different titles to different project operating offices. And this process looked at those proposals that were not successful in order to learn about what is successful and what is not, and what is lying in the future, because people were not successful and other people did not understand what they wanted to propose. So this is also quite interesting to look at these, to look also at failures, and to look at what's lying ahead there. And that all has to do with language.
Yeah, really nice. And just, I mean, we're almost out of time, but I'm also looking at what's written in the chat, Nimika. I mean, you have a clear question. So how do you pitch a Foresight project to a policymaker? Does anyone have a suggestion for Nimika before we close? What's the best way? Is it an innovation? Is it a knowledge? Is it a research? What could be a convincing way of doing this? Kerstin, I don't know if you want to respond, or anyone else. Feel free. I mean, we have 1 minute, so please, one short reaction would be great.
Bram, if I just come in on this one, I think the most important way is engagement. So with Foresight processes, we cannot go away from engaging stakeholders throughout the processes. It does not matter how well we coin our phrases. If stakeholders have not been involved in suggesting, in a process, developing say, ideas around how they see their own futures, how they perceive their environment, what they think works and what they don't believe to work, it becomes very difficult to achieve buy-in. So I think stakeholder engagement is the most powerful way to convince a policymaker.
Very good. Yeah. So Nimika, that's something for you to play with. I think Minky wrote something in the chat about making sure that it's clear to them what they get out of it. And I think Dennis was also reflecting on that. So I think that's great. With this, I'd like to close the session. Thank you so much for this engagement, and apologies again for diverging from our agenda, but I just felt it's so nice to have this group of people in the room sharing and asking questions. And I'm really glad that you're all with us and took the time for this. So once again, thanks also to Professor Kerstin. I think it was really great to have your knowledge in the room. Thanks also, Monica. I mean, this is really nice to have your reflections also. I'd like to just close by just sharing one last thing. We've got another webinar being planned already. So that's actually really nice. We've got one on foresight and the future of conflict, implications of food systems. So we've got someone there who's done a PhD in this topic and how we can, integrate conflict and scenario thinking on that front and link it to food systems. So keep an eye out for that one. Please follow and sign us up on our website and LinkedIn. We've got an active group there. And I'd like to also mention once again that we are just launching now the registrations for our next global workshop, the 5th global workshop of Foresight for Food, which will be on the topic of foresight for transformative action in food systems, leadership, resilience, and regional cooperation. And it will be very fitting that we have that in Jordan, where in the Middle East, there's a strong need for cooperation rather than conflict. So just really want to mention that to you, and you're all very much welcome to join us for that also. With that, I'd like to thank everyone and wish you all a great day and hope to see you again.